The lost King of Scotland. The wind howled across the Highlands like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of heather and the whispers of forgotten battles. In the year 1746, the world knew of bonny Prince Charlie and the doomed Jacobite rising, but few remembered the name that had been deliberately erased from Scottish history. King Malcolm IV, known to those who still spoke of him in hushed tones as Malcolm the Forgotten. His story began not in the grand halls of Edinburgh or Stirling, but in a crumbling monastery perched on the edge of Loch Ness, where the water churned dark and mysterious beneath granite cliffs. It was there, in the summer of 1153, that a young monk named Brother Aldwin discovered a cache of documents hidden beneath the flagstones of the chapel floor. The parchments were ancient even then, their edges brittle with age, their words written in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic that required weeks of careful translation. What Brother Aldwin uncovered would change everything he thought he knew about Scottish history. The documents spoke of a king who had ruled for barely 3 years in the mid-11th century, a monarch whose reign had been so thoroughly obliterated from the records that even the chroniclers of later generations had no knowledge of his existence. This was Malcolm, son of Duncan I, elder brother to the man history would remember as Malcolm III, called Canmore, the great chief. The true Malcolm, the elder son, had been chosen as king in the year 1057, following the death of Macbeth at the Battle of Lumphanan. He was 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of autumn wheat and eyes that held the depth of the northern seas. Unlike his younger brother, who had spent years in exile at the English court, Malcolm had been raised among the Highland clans, learning their ways, speaking their tongue, understanding the ancient customs that bound the people to the land. His coronation took place on the hill of Scone, where Scottish kings had been crowned since time immemorial. The stone of destiny sat beneath him as the assembled nobles placed the crown upon his head, and for a moment it seemed that Scotland had found a king who could unite the fractured kingdom, heal the wounds left by decades of warfare, and restore the old ways that were slowly being forgotten. But Malcolm IV's vision for Scotland differed dramatically from what the powerful southern lords desired. While they looked to England and the growing Norman influence, Malcolm turned his gaze to the ancient Celtic traditions, to the laws of tanistry and the communal ownership of land that had governed his people for generations. He refused to grant vast estates to Norman knights, rejected the feudal system that was transforming England, and insisted that Scottish law and custom should remain supreme in Scottish lands. Within months of his coronation, the conspiracies began. The southern lords, many of whom had married into Norman families or held lands on both sides of the border, saw Malcolm's policies as dangerously backward, a rejection of the progress and civilization that the Norman influence promised. They whispered in dark corners about the young king's stubbornness, his preference for Highland counsel over their own wisdom, his determination to preserve a way of life they believed was destined for extinction. The leader of this faction was Thorfinn Sigurdsson, Earl of Orkney, a man of mixed Norse and Scottish blood who controlled vast territories in the north. Thorfinn had supported Macbeth's claim to the throne and had only grudgingly accepted the return of Duncan's line. He saw in young Malcolm not a king, but an obstacle to his own ambitions. Joining him were several powerful southern lords, Gospatric, who held lands in Northumbria, Siward's sons, who remembered their father's campaigns in Scotland, and most significantly, Malcolm's own younger brother, the prince who history would later crown as Malcolm III. The younger Malcolm, barely 18 years old, but already hardened by his years in England, had absorbed the Norman worldview completely. He had seen the great stone castles rising across England, witnessed the efficiency of Norman administration, and understood the power that came from adopting these new methods. Where his brothers saw the preservation of Scottish identity, the younger Malcolm saw opportunity and advancement. The conspiracy took shape over many months, conducted in whispered conversations and sealed letters carried by trusted messengers. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would not merely depose King Malcolm IV, they would erase him entirely. His reign would be stricken from the records, his name removed from the list of Scottish kings, his very existence denied by future generations. It would be as if he had never ruled at all, as if the crown had passed directly from Duncan I to Malcolm III, with nothing but Macbeth's usurpation in between. In the early spring of 1060, the trap was sprung. King Malcolm was invited to a gathering of the northern lords at Inverness, ostensibly to discuss matters of defence against Norse raiders. He travelled with a small retinue of loyal men, never suspecting that he rode toward betrayal. On the third night of his stay, as he slept in a chamber of Inverness Castle, armed men burst through the door. The fight was brief but fierce. Malcolm's personal guard died defending him, their blood staining the stone floor. The king himself killed 2 attackers before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But they did not kill him. That was crucial to the plan. A dead king could become a martyr, a rallying point for rebellion. Instead, they needed him to disappear, to vanish so completely that doubt would cloud any future claims of his existence. Bound in chains and gagged to silence his protests, Malcolm was smuggled out of Inverness Castle before dawn. A body, some nameless man of similar build, was dressed in the king's nightclothes and left dead in his chamber, his face so mutilated by sword strokes that identification would be impossible. The official story spread quickly. The king had been murdered by unknown assassins, likely Norse raiders or supporters of Macbeth's line seeking revenge. The younger Malcolm, displaying appropriate grief and righteous anger, was crowned within a fortnight. His first acts as king were telling. He granted extensive lands to Norman knights, established feudal obligations throughout the southern lowlands, and began the transformation of Scotland into a kingdom that resembled its southern neighbour. The old Celtic laws were gradually suppressed, replaced by Norman legal codes. The ancient system of tanistry, where kings were chosen by merit rather than strict primogeniture, was abandoned in favour of direct inheritance. And what of the true Malcolm, the forgotten king? He was taken in darkness to a remote monastery on the Isle of Skye, a place so isolated that few even knew of its existence. There, in a stone cell overlooking the churning waters of the Minch, he would spend the remainder of his days, forbidden from speaking his true name, watched constantly by guards who ensured he could never escape or make contact with the outside world. The monks who tended him were sworn to secrecy under pain of excommunication and death. They knew him only as Brother Columba, a nobleman who had taken holy orders after some unnamed transgression. Malcolm IV, rightful King of Scotland, disappeared into the mists of obscurity, while his brother wore the crown and shaped the kingdom according to his Norman-influenced vision. Yet the conspirators had underestimated the loyalty of some of Malcolm's followers. A handful of Highland chiefs who had supported the true king suspected foul play. They could not believe that assassins had struck so precisely, killing Malcolm while leaving his brother conveniently alive and ready to assume power. These men began their own quiet investigation, sending trusted agents to gather information, piece together rumors, follow the faint trails that the conspirators had tried so hard to erase. It took 3 years, but eventually they found him. A fisherman from the Isle of Skye, travelling to the mainland to sell his catch, mentioned to a contact in Fort William that the monastery on the western coast of the island housed a mysterious prisoner, a man who bore himself like nobility despite his monk's robes, who sometimes wept while staring across the water toward the mainland, who had eyes the colour of the northern seas. The loyal chiefs convened in secret, meeting in a hidden glen where their ancestors had gathered before battles in ages past. They debated long into the night about what should be done. Some argued for immediate action, gather their forces, rescue their true king, march on Edinburgh and expose the usurper. Others counselled caution, pointing out that Malcolm III was now firmly established on the throne, supported by powerful Norman allies, commanding armies that far outnumbered anything the Highland chiefs could muster. In the end, wisdom prevailed over passion. They decided to send a single man to the monastery, someone who could verify the prisoner's identity, and, if he was indeed their lost king, offer him hope that he had not been entirely forgotten. The man chosen for this dangerous mission was Cormac MacLeod, a warrior in his 40th year who had served in Malcolm IV's personal guard and had miraculously survived the massacre at Inverness by being absent that night on another errand. Cormac travelled to Skye in the guise of a pilgrim seeking spiritual guidance. The monastery accepted him without suspicion. They received few visitors, but turned none away who came in genuine faith. For 2 weeks, Cormac lived among the monks, participating in their prayers and labours, carefully observing everyone he encountered, searching for the man he had once sworn to protect with his life. He found him in the monastery garden, tending to herbs with hands that had once wielded a sword with deadly skill. The years had aged Malcolm. He was now 26, but looked older, his hair touched with premature grey, his face lined with sorrow and resignation. Yet Cormac knew him instantly, would have known him anywhere. Those distinctive eyes that could belong to no other. Their meeting had to be carefully orchestrated. Cormac waited until the afternoon prayers, when most of the monks gathered in the chapel, leaving only a few brothers working in the gardens and outbuildings. He approached Malcolm while the deposed king knelt among the rosemary and thyme, his hands dark with soil, his monk's robe dusty from his labours. "Brother Columba," Cormac said quietly, using the name the monks knew, "might I seek your counsel on a spiritual matter?" Malcolm looked up, and for a heartbeat, recognition flashed across his features. But years of captivity had taught him caution. He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, my son, walk with me, and we shall talk." They moved deeper into the garden, away from the monastery buildings, toward a low stone wall that overlooked the sea. Only when they were certain no one could overhear did Cormac speak again, this time in the Gaelic tongue, rather than the Latin the monks preferred. "My lord," he said simply, "your people have not forgotten you." Malcolm closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they glistened with tears he refused to let fall. "Cormac," he whispered, "you survived Inverness. Thank God. I had feared all my loyal men perished that night." "Most did, sire, but a handful of us escaped, and we have been searching for you these 3 years past. The Highland chiefs know of your imprisonment. They would raise armies to free you if you but give the word." For a long moment, Malcolm said nothing, staring out across the water toward the mainland, toward the kingdom that should have been his. The wind pulled at his robes, carrying the salt scent of the sea and the distant cries of seabirds. "No," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Too much blood has already been spilled in Scotland's name. If the chiefs rise up now, my brother will crush them utterly. The Norman armies will devastate the Highlands. The people will suffer for my sake, and I cannot bear that burden." "But you are the rightful king," Cormac protested. "Malcolm III sits on a throne built on treachery and lies. History must know the truth." "History," Malcolm said bitterly, "is written by those who hold power, not by those who hold the right. My brother has already succeeded in erasing me from the chronicles. To future generations, I will be nothing more than a footnote if I am remembered at all. Perhaps that is for the best." "How can you say such a thing? You fought for Scotland, for the old ways, for everything our people hold sacred." Malcolm turned from the sea to face his former guard, and Cormac was struck by the change in him. This was no longer the fierce young king who had defied the Norman lords, but a man who had been broken by years of isolation and helplessness, worn down by the knowledge that his sacrifice had changed nothing. "The old ways are dying, Cormac. Perhaps they were always doomed. My brother understands what I was too proud to see. Scotland cannot stand alone against the tide of change sweeping across these islands. The Norman influence will transform us, whether we wish it or not. By resisting, I might have doomed our people to perpetual warfare and poverty. At least my brother's path offers stability, even if it means surrendering much of what made us uniquely Scottish. Then you will remain here. Accept this imprisonment without protest. What choice do I have? If I escape, if I reveal myself, I doom countless others to death in a war they cannot win. Better that I remain Brother Columba, a forgotten man in a forgotten place, and let Scotland move forward without me." Cormac felt his heart break for his king, seeing the defeat in his eyes, the weight of abandonment and loss that bowed his shoulders. "The chiefs asked me to tell you something, sire. They said that even if you cannot be restored to your throne, even if the world never knows your name, they will preserve your memory. They will pass down the truth from father to son, from generation to generation, so that somewhere in some hidden corners of the Highlands, people will always know that once there was a king who fought for them, who chose exile over compromise, who sacrificed everything rather than betray the old ways." For the first time since their conversation began, Malcolm smiled, a sad, weary smile, but genuine nonetheless. "That is worth more than any crown, old friend. Tell them I accept their gift gratefully. Tell them to care for our people, to preserve what they can of our traditions, to remember that being Scottish means more than simply occupying this land. It means carrying forward the values and customs that our ancestors died to protect." They spoke for another hour, sharing news and memories. Two men bound by loyalty and loss, standing at the edge of the world while history moved on without them. When Cormac finally departed the monastery, he carried with him not the vengeful declaration of a deposed king demanding restoration, but rather a message of acceptance and hope, that even in defeat, even in obscurity, Malcolm had found a kind of peace. The Highland chiefs received Cormac's report with mixed emotions. Some raged against Malcolm's decision, arguing that he had no right to deny his people the chance to fight for him. Others understood his wisdom, recognizing that pragmatism sometimes required painful sacrifices. In the end, they honored his wishes. There would be no rebellion, no attempt to rescue him from his island prison, no public revelation of his survival. Instead, they began the long work of preservation. In hidden glens and remote valleys, and whispered stories told by firelight, the true history of Malcolm IV lived on. Bards composed ballads about the lost king, though they were careful never to sing them where spies for Malcolm III might hear. Scribes copied the few documents that proved his existence, hiding them in secret locations where future generations might one day discover them. Brother Aldwin's discovery in 1153 was one fruit of this careful preservation. The documents he found had been hidden there by one of Malcolm's loyal followers, tucked away in the hope that someday someone would find them and learn the truth. The monk spent the last years of his life carefully translating and copying these precious parchments, creating multiple versions that he distributed to trusted contacts throughout Scotland. But the effort to preserve Malcolm's memory faced constant opposition. Malcolm III and his successors worked tirelessly to erase any trace of the forgotten king. Monasteries were searched, suspicious documents were burned. Anyone caught speaking of a Malcolm who had ruled before Malcolm Canmore faced severe punishment. The official history was clear. Duncan I had been succeeded by the usurper Macbeth, who was eventually defeated by Malcolm III. There was no room in this narrative for another Malcolm, no space for a king who had inconveniently embodied values that the new Scotland was leaving behind. On the Isle of Skye, Brother Columba continued his quiet existence. The years passed slowly, marked by the changing seasons and the eternal rhythm of monastic life. He rose before dawn for prayers, worked in the gardens, studied scripture, and maintained his silence about his true identity. The monks who guarded him grew old and were replaced by younger men who knew nothing of the monastery's secret prisoner, who simply saw another brother devoted to a life of prayer and contemplation. Malcolm aged along with his jailers and fellow monks. The grey in his hair spread until it was entirely silver. His hands, once so strong and skilled with weapons, became gnarled with arthritis from years of manual labour. His eyes, those distinctive northern sea eyes that had once burned with passion for his kingdom, grew dim with cataracts. He became an old man, long before his years should have made him so, worn down by isolation and the weight of dreams abandoned. He died in the winter of 1093, 33 years after his deposition, having outlived his usurping brother by 2 years. He was 56 years old, but looked 20 years older. The monks buried him in their cemetery with all the proper rites, marking his grave with a simple stone that bore the name Brother Columba and the dates of his entry into the monastery and his death. No mention was made of his royal blood, his rightful claim to the throne, or the kingdom he had lost. The abbot who presided over the funeral was one of the few remaining monks who knew the truth about Brother Columba's identity. As he scattered holy water over the grave, He whispered a prayer that the official liturgy did not include. Rest now, Malcolm IV, King of Scotland. You fought for your people and lost, but you are not forgotten. Your sacrifice was not in vain, and your memory will endure long after the stones of castles have crumbled to dust. The centuries rolled forward, and Scotland transformed beyond anything Malcolm would have recognised. The Norman influence his brother had welcomed reshaped the kingdom completely. Great stone castles rose across the land, replacing the old hill forts. The feudal system took root, creating a rigid hierarchy of nobles and vassals. The Celtic laws and customs that Malcolm had fought to preserve were gradually suppressed, surviving only in the most remote corners of the Highlands. Yet the memory of the lost king persisted in those hidden corners. In the 18th century, when Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his standard and called the clans to fight for the Stuart cause, old men told their grandsons about another prince, another king, who had been betrayed and forgotten. The parallel was not lost on them. Both men had represented a vision of Scotland that modernity seemed determined to destroy. Both had been defeated not by superior force alone, but by the inevitable march of historical change. After the final defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746, when the British government set about systematically destroying Highland culture, burning clan tartans, banning bagpipes, and forcing the people to abandon their traditional ways of life, a few elderly Highlanders made secret pilgrimages to the Isle of Skye. They sought out the old monastery, which had long since fallen into ruins, and searched among the tumbled stones and overgrown graves for any trace of the king their ancestors had served. Most found nothing. The centuries had erased names from weathered headstones, and the monks who had known the truth were 600 years dead. But one searcher, a man named Angus MacLeod, who claimed descent from Cormac himself, discovered something remarkable. Beneath a collapsed section of the monastery wall, protected by the fallen stones, was a small stone box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the centuries, were 3 parchment pages covered in faded but still legible writing. The documents were in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic, written in different hands, apparently compiled by several authors. They told the story of Malcolm IV, his brief reign, his betrayal, his imprisonment, and his death. They named the conspirators, described the plot in detail, and preserved testimony from witnesses who had seen the deposed king alive, years after he was supposed to have died. Most remarkably, they included a physical description of Malcolm that matched perfectly the few contemporary accounts that had survived, leaving little doubt about the document's authenticity. Angus MacLeod understood immediately what he had found. These pages were proof, fragile, ancient, but undeniable proof that the lost king had existed, that he had been deliberately erased from history, that the official chronicles of Scotland had been falsified to hide an inconvenient truth. He carefully rewrapped the documents and carried them home, where he made meticulous copies before hiding the originals in a new location, learning from history's lesson that precious things should never exist in only one place. He shared the discovery with a small circle of trusted friends, men who still valued the old Highland ways despite the laws forbidding such sentiments. They discussed what should be done with this evidence. Should they publish it, expose the historical lie, demand that Malcolm IV be restored to his rightful place in the Chronicle of Scottish Kings? Or would such a revelation simply invite the authorities to confiscate and destroy these precious documents, silencing the lost king's voice forever. In the end, caution prevailed once again. Scotland in the mid-18th century was a dangerous place for those who clung to old traditions and challenged official narratives. The documents were copied several more times, with the copies distributed to various hiding places throughout the Highlands. The originals were sealed in a metal box and buried in a secret location known only to Angus MacLeod and his eldest son. The story might have ended there, with Malcolm IV remaining a whispered legend, a ghost story told by Highland fireplaces, believed by some but dismissed by most as romantic folklore. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried, and the Lost King was not quite ready to be forgotten. In the late 19th century, during the Victorian period's romantic fascination with Celtic history, a scholar named Dr. James Sinclair began researching anomalies in the Scottish chronicles. He noticed small inconsistencies in the dating of events during Malcolm III's early reign, gaps in the narrative that didn't quite make sense, references in Irish and Welsh documents to Scottish events that the official Scottish histories never mentioned. Being a meticulous researcher, he began compiling these discrepancies, trying to understand what they might indicate. His investigation led him to the Highlands, where he collected oral histories from elderly residents of remote communities. Time and again, he encountered variations of the same story: a king before Malcolm Canmore, a betrayal, an imprisonment, a deliberate erasure. The details varied, and Dr. Sinclair knew that oral tradition could be unreliable, prone to embellishment and confusion. But the consistency of the core narrative, appearing in communities that had little contact with one another, suggested that these stories might have a common root in actual historical events. Dr. Sinclair's research culminated in a scholarly paper published in 1887, titled The Lost King Hypothesis: Evidence for an Erased Reign in 11th Century Scotland. The paper was cautious in its claims, presenting the evidence without making definitive statements, acknowledging the difficulties of proving events that powerful forces had worked hard to obscure. Nevertheless, it created a minor sensation in academic circles, inspiring other scholars to investigate the mystery of Malcolm IV. The truth, when it finally emerged into the light of accepted history, came not from academic research, but from an accident of fate. In 1942, during the Second World War, German bombers targeting industrial sites in Scotland dropped their payload on what they believed to be a factory, but was actually an ancient manor house being used as military storage. The explosion destroyed the building, but also cracked open a sealed chamber in its foundation, a room that had been locked and forgotten for centuries. Among the debris, soldiers found a collection of documents that had survived by pure chance, protected by the manor's thick stone walls, even as the building above them collapsed. These papers, when examined by historians, proved to be a cache of correspondence between Malcolm III and his fellow conspirators, dating from the years 1058 through 1062. The letters discussed the plot against the elder Malcolm in shocking detail, including explicit acknowledgement that they planned not just to depose him, but to erase him from history entirely. The discovery made headlines throughout Britain. Here was proof, written in the conspirators' own hands, that a king named Malcolm had indeed ruled Scotland before Malcolm III, and that his reign had been deliberately suppressed. Academic historians rushed to re-examine the chronicles, looking for other evidence that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct the true story of Malcolm IV, corroborating the oral traditions that Highland communities had preserved for nearly 900 years. Today, Malcolm IV is recognised by historians as a legitimate king of Scotland, though many details of his reign remain obscure. His name has been added to the official list of Scottish monarchs, and scholars continue to uncover new evidence about his brief time on the throne. Yet for all the academic recognition, he remains the lost king, a figure more legendary than historical, a symbol of the paths not taken and the dreams that died before they could be fulfilled. In the Highlands, where his memory was kept alive through centuries of suppression, the vindication of Malcolm's existence brought a measure of satisfaction to the descendants of those who had never forgotten him. The old stories were true after all. There had been a king who fought for the old ways, who chose exile over compromise, who was betrayed and erased, but whose memory survived through sheer, stubborn loyalty. The monastery on Skye, where Malcolm spent his final years, is now a protected historical site. Archaeologists have excavated the ruins, finding among the remains a grave that might be his, though definitive identification is impossible after so many centuries. A simple monument stands there now, bearing an inscription that attempts to summarize a complex life in a few brief words. Here lies Malcolm IV, King of Scotland, who ruled from 1057 to 1060. He fought for his people and lost, but he was not forgotten. The Lost King's story resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental human experiences. The pain of betrayal, the weight of impossible choices, the courage required to accept defeat with dignity. Malcolm IV could have condemned his people to endless warfare in defense of his crown. Instead, he chose obscurity and isolation, allowing history to move forward without him, preserving peace at the cost of his own legacy. In that choice, perhaps, lies his true greatness, not in the battles he might have won or the reforms he might have implemented, but in his willingness to surrender everything when he understood that fighting would bring only suffering to those he had sworn to protect. The forgotten king became, in the end, the sacrificial king, offering himself so that others might live. His name may have been erased from the chronicles for centuries, his reign reduced to a footnote in academic texts, but the lost King of Scotland achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of suppression could destroy. He lives on in the stories still told by Highland firesides, in the scholarly debates about Scotland's medieval history, in the hearts of all who understand that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting to the end, but in knowing when to let go. And somewhere, in hidden places throughout Scotland, the documents that Angus MacLeod copied so carefully still exist, waiting to be discovered by future generations. The lost king's voice continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder that history is never quite as simple as it seems, that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it, and that the forgotten are often the ones most worth remembering. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World. The sea was a slow, breathing thing that night, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. Above it, the sky curved vast and dark, its stars pricked into existence like tiny fires along the roof of the world. A longship rode those gentle swells, its dragon-headed prow cutting a quiet path through the moonlit water. The oars were drawn in, the sail slack, and the men aboard lay in cloaks and furs, drifting in a shallow, watchful sleep. Only one figure remained fully awake. Leif stood near the prow, one hand resting on the carved dragon's neck, his other hand wrapped around the leather strap of his cloak as the wind nudged at him. The air smelled of salt and old ice, like the breath of the northern seas he had known since childhood. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the curve of the ocean, lay Greenland, with its sharp cliffs and scattered settlements pressed up against the edge of the world they believed they knew. Ahead, there was only darkness and the whisper of something more. He listened to the water stroking the hull, the faint creak of wood, the soft exhale of sleeping men. It felt to him as though the ship moved not just across the ocean, but across time and memory, gliding toward a story that had been waiting centuries to be told his father's tales. The rumors told in Icelandic halls, the whispered accounts of a strange shoreline found by accident. All of them drifted through his mind like low clouds. They said there was land out here, land beyond Greenland, beyond the shifting floes and cold fogs, land with forests so thick you could walk among trees for days, land with rivers that ran clear and deep, land where grapes grew wild, where game was plentiful, where the air itself seemed gentler. Some had laughed at the idea, others had shrugged and let it pass like any other tale told next to a fire. But the story had grown roots in Leif's mind and taken hold. Now, as the ship glided under the stars, he felt that story pulling him forward. A soft footstep sounded behind him. "You do not sleep," came a low voice. Leif turned slightly. It was Tyrkir, the older man who had travelled with his family for so long. He was as much kin as any blood relative. His hair was threaded with grey, his beard thick, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Someone should watch the sea," Leif murmured. "The sea will still be here in the morning," Tyrkir replied gently. "It always is." Leif's gaze slipped back to the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness and the faint line where sea met sky. "Do you remember," he asked quietly, "what my father said about the land to the west?" Tyrkir stepped up beside him, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. "I remember many things your father said. Some of them were wise, some were spoken after too much mead." A faint smile touched his lips. "But yes, I remember. A coast glimpsed in bad weather. A ship blown off course strange woods. No settlements, only the promise of what might be." Leif nodded slowly. "It feels close, as if we have been drifting toward it our whole lives without knowing." "Stories have a way of doing that," Tyrkir said. "They lie in wait until someone is willing to sail far enough to meet them." The wind shifted, stroking the sail. Somewhere in the darkness, a wave rose a little higher than the others, and then slumped beneath the hull with a soft, hollow sound. The motion swayed the men sleeping along the benches, but they did not wake. The night seemed to fold around the ship like a cloak, isolating it in a small moving circle of creaks and whispers. "Sleep, Leif," Tyrkir said at last. "Morning will come whether you watch for it or not, and you will need clear eyes when it does." Leif hesitated, then nodded. He gave the dragon's head a final, absent pat, as if to reassure the ship itself, and made his way back toward the center of the longship. He lay down among his men, the boards cool beneath him, his cloak scratching lightly against his cheek. The motion of the sea cradled him, slow and patient. His thoughts drifted backward to Greenland, to Iceland, to the tales of the old country across the ocean, but always, like a needle returning to north, his mind turned toward that unnamed shore ahead. He imagined it dimly, a line of land appearing out of morning mist, and as the rocking lulled him at last toward sleep, he felt as though that distant coastline was already watching them approach. Morning stole into the sky gradually, the stars fading one by one, as if some unseen hand were gently snuffing them out. A pale band of light appeared in the east, spreading across the water until the sea shivered with brightness. The men stirred, rolling in their cloaks, blinking at the day. Oars were quietly shifted. A few muttered prayers. Someone coughed, the sound swallowed quickly by the open air. Leif rose, his muscles stiff, but his thoughts sharp. The wind had strengthened, and the sail now caught it, full and rounded, drawing the ship forward with renewed purpose. Foam hissed along the sides. Above, a few seabirds circled, white and grey against the lightning sky. He watched them, feeling his heart quicken. "We are still far from known waters," one of the men murmured, stepping to stand beside him. It was Bjarni, broad-shouldered, with sunburned cheeks and a steady gaze. "Yet there are birds." "Birds mean land," Leif replied quietly. "Somewhere ahead, somewhere near. They do not drift so far from shore for nothing." They sailed on. The hours of the day seemed to stretch and thin, like threads pulled slowly from a loom. The men rowed in turns when the wind slackened, their oars dipping in and out of the water with the slow, unhurried rhythm of practiced work. When the breeze returned, they rested, letting the ship glide. They ate simply, dried fish, bread hard as wood, water carefully portioned, and spoke little. The ocean had a way of taking speech and folding it back into itself until silence felt more natural. But in each quiet glance toward the horizon, there was an unspoken question. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the world shifted. A darker line appeared along the edge of the water, so faint at first it was easy to mistake it for a trick of light, or a cloud bank hanging low. Yet as the longship moved steadily forward, that line did not dissolve. Instead, it grew more distinct, separating itself from sea and sky. The closer they came, the more it took on shape, a low, rolling shadow that stretched across the distance. Leif's breath caught. Without meaning to, he placed a hand again on the dragon's head, as he had in the night, as if seeking balance. "Land," someone whispered. The words spread softly along the length of the ship. Men rose from their benches, squinting against the light, craning their necks. Tyrkir moved forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the distant shoreline. "This is no ice," he said after a moment. "No floating bergs, no broken fields of white. This is earth." The ship pressed on. The air began to change as the day dipped lower, carrying scents that were not of the open sea. There was a hint of moss, of soil warmed beneath unseen trees, of something green and quiet. The men fell even more silent, each feeling in his own way the strange intimacy of approaching a land no one among them had ever known. Closer still, and they could see that the coastline was not sheer and forbidding, but gathered into soft rises and dips. Low hills met the water, with darker bands of what could only be forest beyond. The sky above that distant land seemed somehow gentler, its colours washed with a faint, hazy gold. They felt a slow, deep calm settle over him. Fear, excitement, wonder, all of it blended into something steady. This was what he had come for. what the ship itself seemed made for, to slip across the unknown and press its prow against a shore that had, until now, existed only in half-remembered stories and scattered rumours. "Bring us in slowly," he said. "We'll look for a bay, a quiet place to land." The men bent to their work with a muted, reverent readiness. The longship angled nearer the shoreline, its sails shifting, oars dipping lightly to guide it. The water shallowed gradually, turning from deep indigo to softer hues, greenish and lit from beneath where the sun's light reached toward the unseen bottom. In the distance, a small cove opened in the coastline, a sheltered curve where the land embraced the sea in a gentle arc. The approach was clear of rocks. The water, calm grasses trailed along the edge, and beyond them, a scatter of low shrubs and the first hints of taller trees, their leaves stirring faintly in the breeze. "That will do," Leif murmured. They glided into the cove as evening colours thickened in the sky. The oars pulled back. The men prepared the anchor stone, letting it slide down with a soft, muffled splash. The longship settled into stillness, the faint rocking of the water, now a reassuring cradle rather than a ceaseless journey. For a long moment, no one moved. They listened to the soft lap of waves against the hull, to the distant rustle of leaves on unknown trees, to the calls of birds they did not recognize. The land, so close now, seemed to breathe quietly, an immense presence that had been waiting patiently for their arrival. Leif drew in a slow breath of air that tasted of soil and growth, different from the sharp salt tang he had known for weeks. "We will go ashore," he said gently. "Not in a rush. Step by step. The sea has carried us far. Let us meet this place with respect." They lowered a small boat and drifted toward the narrow strip of shore. The water around them was glassy, reflecting the subtle colours of the sky. As the keel brushed the sand, a quiet shiver passed through the men, as if they were crossing a boundary, not just of distance, but of time itself. Leif stepped out first. His boots sank slightly into the damp, cool sand. The sensation was strangely profound, as if the earth itself were acknowledging him. He walked a little farther up the beach, until the sand gave way to firmer ground, then stopped and simply stood there. Behind him, the others followed, their footfalls soft. They spread out slowly, touching the low shrubs, bending to feel the texture of unfamiliar plants, lifting their faces to smell the air. No settlement greeted them, no smoke, no voices. Only the quiet murmur of the waves and the occasional call of a bird from the forest's edge. "This is it," Bjarni said quietly, his voice almost breath. "We have stepped onto a land that no one in our world truly knows." Leif nodded. "We will learn its shape," he replied. "We will walk its forests, drink from its streams, and see what stories it holds. And we will carry those stories back, so others may know that the world is wider than they imagined." They moved inland a short distance, careful, unhurried. The ground rose gently, dotted with stones and small patches of grass. The trees beyond were tall and unfamiliar, their leaves shimmering softly in the breeze. Shadows deepened among their trunks as the light faded, but it was not an unfriendly darkness. It felt alive, watchful, without being hostile. As they explored the edge of the woods, Tyrkir knelt beside a low vine that trailed across a small rise. Dark clusters of berries hung from it, heavy and ripe. He studied them intently, his face lit with an old, deep memory of other lands, other harvests. "Leif," he called softly. "Come see." Leif joined him, crouching beside the vine. Tirkir plucked a berry, rolling it between his fingers. "I have seen the like before," he murmured, "back in the southern lands, beyond our northern seas. Grapes, or something very like them. Grapes!" The word hung in the air like a promise. "This is a good place," Leif said at last. "A gentle place. Perhaps it will be our Vinland, a land of wine and growth." They did not shout or cheer. The moment was too large for that. Instead, they shared a quiet, steady look, the kind that passes between people who realize they're standing at the opening of a door that will never close again. They returned to the ship at dusk, the sky now brushed with long strokes of purple and deep blue. Stars kindled once more, scattered across the firmament. The men settled in, their voices soft, their movements slowed by a deep, peaceful fatigue that came not just from travel, but from the weight of what they had found. Leif lay awake for a time, listening to the mingled sounds of land and sea. The waves lapped gently against the hull. Somewhere in the nearby forest, a night creature called, an unfamiliar voice in the darkness, neither threatening nor inviting, simply present. He felt the world expanding around him, like the sea had once expanded in his imagination when he first heard tales of distant shores. Now, those shores were under his feet. The map in his mind was no longer bounded by the edges of old stories. It pushed outward, making room for this new coastline, these new trees, these new stars overhead. As sleep finally drew him under, it seemed to him that the dragon-headed ship, resting quietly in the cove, was no longer perched at the edge of the world. Instead, it lay anchored in the middle of a much larger, deeper mystery, one that would carry ripples far into the future, long after their names were forgotten. The night passed, and with the dawn, the work of understanding the land began. They spent the next days exploring the coast, moving carefully along the shoreline, landing where small rivers met the sea, where sheltered inlets offered calm waters, where the forest opened into gentle meadows. They moved like guests who did not yet know the language of their host, watching, listening, learning the quiet patterns of wind and grass and water. They found streams cold and clear, their beds lined with smooth stones. They found stands of tall trees, some dark and needled, others broad-leafed and shifting with every breath of wind. They saw birds whose calls were strange to their ears, and animals slipping through the underbrush, quick shadows in the greenery. At each landing, they left the place as undisturbed as they could, taking only what they needed, marking little. They built small fires, careful with the embers, letting the smoke drift upward in faint grey tendrils. As they sat around those fires at night, the faces of the men flickered in the glow, their eyes reflecting both the light of the flames and the unspoken wonder of being so far from home in a land that had never known their kind. Sometimes, as the embers settled and the conversation faded, someone would speak up softly, telling of other voyages, of Iceland's cold shores, of Greenland's hard edges, of storms weathered and ice fields skirted. Those stories, once the farthest reach of their imagination, now felt like steps along a path that had led here. Leif listened to them all with quiet attention. The more they walked this new coastline, the more he felt that they were not just adding to their own saga, but stitching this land into the larger fabric of the world. They knew it had waited, silent and patient, while their people had sailed and settled the north. Now, at last, the threads had crossed. On one of those evenings, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered overhead in a calm, untroubled sky, Leif lifted his gaze and let it wander across the constellations he had followed since childhood, the familiar shapes that guided sailors across the vastness. "They have always been there," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The stars, the lands, the currents. We have only just learned to see the paths between them." Tirkir, seated nearby, nodded slowly. "And others may walk those paths after us," he replied. "In time, this land will not be a whisper, but a place with a name spoken in many halls." Leif thought of that, of ships like theirs, of families, of settlements, of fires lit along this distant shore, voices rising in languages that had never touched this air before. The idea felt both distant and very close, like a shadow cast by a fire yet to be lit. For now, though, the land remained mostly untouched, their presence a small ripple in a vast, quiet sea of time. They would not stay long. Their purpose was to see, to know, to remember, and then to return. Yet even as they made their preparations, gathering small sample of wood and grapes and other signs of the richness they had found, a soft certainty settled in Leif's heart. This was not the end of the story. This was only the first line, spoken into the hush of a sleeping world. He felt it in the way the wind curled around the sail, in the way the waves welcomed the keel, in the way the forest watched them with a patience that suggested it expected more visitors in ages to come. When at last they turned the prow of the ship away from the shore and let the wind catch the sail for the journey back toward Greenland, Leif did not feel that they were leaving the land behind. Instead, it felt as though the memory of it had already travelled ahead of them, carried in the shape of the waves, in the flight of birds, in the changing light on the water. The longship moved smoothly across the sea, and the coastline slowly diminished, a dark line, then a smudge, then only an idea. But in the minds of those aboard, it remained vivid. The taste of the air, the softness of the sand beneath their boots, the rustle of leaves and trees that had never known the sound of their speech before. As night fell and the stars reappeared, steady and unchanging, Leif lay awake once more beneath the sky. The same constellations that had accompanied them west now stretched overhead, guiding them eastward toward home. Yet home itself had shifted, its boundaries stretched by what they had seen. He closed his eyes and saw again the curve of that sheltered cove, the ripples along its surface, the way the forest waded just beyond the line of shore. The voyages, he realized, were not just paths cut through the sea. They were threads binding places together, making the world feel at once larger and more connected. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, he felt himself drifting gently toward sleep as the ship rocked and the waves whispered their long, slow lullaby. Years later, long after the first journey, when the memory of that gentle coastline settled into the hearts of many, other ships would follow. The ocean did not change its nature for them. It remained the same vast, restless being, breathing wind and wave, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce. Yet the men who set out upon it were different. They carried with them the knowledge that the sea did not simply fall away into nothingness beyond Greenland. They knew there was land in that wide westward silence, land with forests and flowing waters, land where grapes and game and timber might be found. And so the voyages continued. One ship, smaller than Leif's, but sturdy and well made, set out from Greenland under a sky streaked with pale clouds. Among its crew were men and women who had heard the stories of Vinland as children, their imaginations shaped by the tales of their elders. Now, they wanted to see for themselves what lay beyond the horizon. The leader of this voyage, Karlsefni, stood at the helm with a quiet determination. He had listened to Leif's accounts by the longhouse fire, had seen the wood and grapes and other tokens brought back from that distant shore. To him, Finland was not just a curiosity, it was a possibility, a place where families might settle, where farms might take root, where winter might be kinder than in the cold, hard lands of the north. As the ship rocked gently on the swells, his gaze travelled over the faces of those aboard. There were strong-armed sailors, used to hauling nets and rowing through sleet. There were women cradling children, their eyes bright with both worry and hope. There were older men, grey in hair, but still sharp of mind, who had seen many coasts and now wished to see one more. Crossing was not simple. There were days when fog wrapped itself around the ship so tightly that the world shrank to the sound of water against the hull and the feel of damp air on their skin. There were nights when the wind rose and the waves lifted them high, then dropped them deep into cold hollows, the ship's timbers groaning softly with the strain. Yet they held to their course, guided by the stars and currents, and by the quiet belief that beyond the arc of the sea, that remembered shore still waited. When, at last, the birds appeared and the scent of unseen earth drifted over the water, a murmur passed along the ship. People straightened, eyes turned eagerly toward the horizon. As before, the first sight of land came like a slow revelation, a dark line, a soft shape, a coastline emerging from haze. Karlsefni stood silent as they approached, his heart beating in slow, heavy thuds. For him, this was more than the fulfillment of a story. It was the opening of a new chapter in the lives of those who had left behind their homes for the unknown. They found, not far from where Leif's ship had once anchored, a place that seemed well suited to their hopes. A gentle river flowed into the sea, its mouth widening into a sheltered bay. Meadows spread along its banks, and beyond them, forested hills rose in quiet layers. They landed cautiously, as Leif's crew had done years before, stepping onto the sand with a mixture of reverence and careful curiosity. But this time, there was more activity, more movement. They unloaded goods, tools, livestock. They walked the ground not just as visitors, but as people looking for the best places to build shelters, to plant crops, to tether animals. The land received them with the same quiet patience it had shown the first explorers. The river ran on, untroubled, its surface reflecting the sky. Birds flitted through the trees, indifferent to the newcomers. Wind moved in the grass with a sound like the soft breathing of a sleeping world. They built their first dwellings near the river's edge, simple structures of timber and turf, low but sturdy, their roofs blending into the land itself. Smoke soon began to curl upward from their hearths, thin grey lines against the sky. Children's voices, unsure at first, then more confident, mixed with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. At night, the people of this small settlement gathered around their fires, the glow casting gentle halos around their faces. They spoke of home, of Greenland's harsh winters, of Iceland's volcanic shores, of the old stories from Norway and beyond. Yet more and more, their words turned to this place, the feel of the soil beneath their hands, the taste of its water, the paths through its forests. They gave names to the river, to the bay, to the nearby hills, stitching their own language into the fabric of the land. Those names, carried on the wind and spoken over meals, warmed the place with a quiet familiarity. Yet they knew they were not alone in this wide world. In time, they saw signs that others lived here too. Not their kind, but people whose presence was written in the remains of fires, in tracks along the riverbank, in tools left near berry bushes. The first encounters were distant, a glimpse of figures in the trees, a canoe moving quietly along the far shore of the river, the echo of voices carried by the wind. Karlsefni, standing at the edge of the forest one morning, saw 3 figures watching from across a meadow. They were still as stones, yet he could feel their alertness even at a distance. He lifted his hand, palm open, a gesture as old as greeting itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the figures lifted a hand as well, mirroring his motion. The moment passed like a breath. The figures melted back into the trees, gone as silently as they had appeared. Life in the settlement unfolded in rhythms shaped by the land. They fished in the river, the lines dipping into water that ran quiet and deep. They hunted game in the forest, moving with care, learning where the deer passed, where the wild animals drank at dusk. They gathered berries and other plants, guided sometimes by what they already knew, sometimes by cautious experimentation. Season followed season. The days grew longer, then shorter, then longer again. The settlers began to sense how the year turned in this new place, how the light shifted and the winds changed. Winter came, but it was softer than the winters of Greenland. Snow fell, but it did not seem as heavy. The river froze along its edges, but not entirely. The forest, even in its bareness, felt alive. Yet with all the gentleness of the land, there were difficulties. Crops did not always grow as expected. The unfamiliar plants sometimes concealed dangers hunting could be uncertain, and beneath everything lay an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the invisible lines between their world and that of the maple who already lived here were delicate. Sometimes at night, Karlsefni lay awake, listening to the sounds beyond the walls of his hall, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of sleepers, the distant hoot of an owl. He thought of how far they were from the familiar coasts of home, how thin the line of their presence was here. It felt like a small flame burning in a vast darkness, beautiful, hopeful, but fragile. He did not speak of this often. Instead, he rose each morning and joined in the work, repairing structures, planning hunting trips, walking the paths near the settlement's edge, watching the tree line where the forest began. Over time, the encounters with the native people of the land grew more frequent. There were moments of quiet exchange, a shared fish, a traded tool, a hesitant smile. There were moments of tension, when a movement was misunderstood or a boundary crossed unknowingly. People of the settlement began to understand that they were not simply writing their own story here. They had entered into a story already in progress, one with its own deep roots and countless voices. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the river's surface turned to silver, Karlsefni stood with a small group near the edge of the settlement. A canoe approached along the river, paddled by two figures. They came slowly, without haste, their motions smooth and calm. When they drew near the shore, they paused, measuring the distance, measuring the faces watching them. Karlsefni stepped forward, leaving his weapons behind. He held out a small object, a piece of cloth dyed with a bright, rich color. The canoe's nearer paddler studied it for a moment, then reached into a woven bag and brought out a carved object, a small figure of wood shaped with care. They traded, hands crossing briefly over the water between canoe and shore. No words were shared that either side could understand. Yet in that exchange, something quiet passed between them, a recognition that, for all the distance and difference, they shared the same sky, the same river, the same night that would soon settle over the land. The voyages of the Vikings to this new world were not only journeys of distance, they were journeys of understanding, incomplete and fragile as all first meetings are. Those who came built their homes, but also carried with them the weight of their own history, their own ways of seeing the world. The land, already rich with the stories of those who had lived here for generations beyond counting, received them, but did not yield its entirety. In time, many of the settlers would leave. Some would find the uncertainties too great, tensions too wearing. Others would simply long for the familiar contours of their old homes. The sea, which had carried them here, would carry them back again. Their houses would stand for a while, then slowly dissolve into the earth, wood rotting, turf blending back into soil. Grass would grow where walls once stood. Trees would reclaim open spaces. The river would continue its slow journey to the sea, indifferent to the brief presence of those who had paused along its banks. Yet the memory of these voyages would persist. In Greenland, in Iceland, in the far halls of Norway, tales would be told of Finland, the gentle land to the west where grapes grew and winters were kind. For some, the tales would be almost dreamlike, blurred at the edges, more myth than record. For others, they would be as real as the feel of salt spray on one's face. Parents would tell their children about the time their kin had crossed a vast unknown and touched a shore no one had known before. Around fires, in the dark of winter, voices would speak of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that carried sunlight along their surfaces, of birds whose cries were unlike any heard in the north. They would speak of canoes on quiet waters, of wary greetings, of the realization that the world was filled with many peoples, each with their own ways, their own understanding of the land. Generations would pass, the voyages would slip into the long river of memory, mingling with other tales of far journeys and harsh seas. Some would forget the exact details, names would fade, dates would blur, but the core of the story would remain, that once, long before many would believe or fully understand it, ships from the far north had sailed across the western sea and touched another continent. Far to the west, where the river flowed into the sea and the forest watched the shore, the land remembered in its own way. The old paths through the trees remained, traced by animals and people alike. The places where fires had once burned held a different quality to the soil, a subtle richness. A stone that had once been shaped by hands far from this place might lie half buried in the earth. moss creeping slowly over it, its meaning lost, yet its presence undeniable. Birds flew overhead, following their own inherited routes. Seasons turned. Children born in the villages of the land grew up with their own stories, some of which included mention of strangers in longboats, of brief visits, of small exchanges. For them, these were not tales of discovery, but of encounters, moments when different worlds brushed lightly against each other before moving apart again. The sea, indifferent to questions of who came first or who discovered whom, continued to rise and fall, its waves erasing and redrawing the shoreline in small, ceaseless ways. It remembered each ship that had crossed its surface only as a disturbance in its pattern, a momentary reordering of foam and current. Yet, in some sense, each voyage left an imprint, not in the water itself, but in the minds and hearts of those who sailed, and in the stories they carried home. Centuries later, when other ships from other lands would make similar crossings, guided by different maps and driven by different desires, the ocean would greet them with the same impartial motion, the land would receive them with the same quiet patience. New names would be given, new flags planted, new claims spoken. But beneath all of that, the older truth would remain. The world had always been wide, always filled with countless lives and stories, long before people set sail to measure it with their own eyes. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World were a part of that truth. A series of journeys that, like soft waves, rolled gently from one shore to another, leaving behind traces that would sometimes be forgotten, sometimes rediscovered. Their longships, with their dragon heads and curved hulls, were instruments of curiosity as much as of bravery, carrying not just warriors, but farmers, traders, families, dreams. In the quiet of a long northern night, when the wind howled outside and snow pressed against the walls, it was easy to imagine those longships again, to see them drifting under a sky sprayed with stars, their sails catching the pale light of the moon. To picture men wrapped in cloaks against the chill, staring into the darkness ahead, and wondering what shape the morning would bring to the edge of the sea. A storyteller, seated by the hearth, might pause and let the silence stretch. The listeners, leaning closer, would feel the hush deepen, as if the room itself were waiting. Then, in a soft, steady voice, the storyteller would speak of Leif and his men, stealing through the night toward a coastline they had only half believed in, of the first step onto that damp, cool sand, of the grapes on the vine, heavy and ripe beneath an unfamiliar sky, of Karlsefni's settlement beside the river, of the smoke rising in thin spirals, of the quiet exchanges along the water's edge. The words would flow like the sea, calm and unhurried, carrying the listeners in their minds across the centuries and over the waves, until they could almost feel the rocking of the longship beneath them, hear the creak of the timbers, smell the mingled scents of salt and pine and distant earth. Outside, the wind would go on blowing and the snow would keep falling, but inside, by the fire, the world would gently widen, the edges of the map softening and flowing outward to make space for that distant shore. In that moment, the voyages would not be something lost in the past. They would be happening again, here, in the quiet space between words and breath. The longships would be gliding once more toward a waiting coastline. The stars would be shining above them, as they always had, as they always would. And as the story settled into its final, soft cadence, as the listener's eyes grew heavy and their thoughts began to drift, the sense would remain that the world is vast and filled with hidden coasts, that beyond each known horizon there may lie a shore waiting peacefully for the moment someone is brave enough or curious enough to seek it. The fire would sink into embers. The room would dim. Sleep would fold itself gently around the listeners as the memory of waves and distant forests and starlit sails lingered lightly in their minds. Somewhere in that hazy space between waking and dreams, they would feel themselves carried across a wide, calm sea toward a distant line of land where the river meets the ocean and the trees whisper softly in a language older than any map. And there, upon that quiet shore, the voyages of the Vikings to the New World would go on, not as battles or conquests, but as a slow, enduring echo, a reminder that the world has always been broader, more mysterious, and more beautifully connected than any single story can fully contain. The island that appears and vanishes overnight. You've heard the stories your entire life, dismissed them as sailors' tales, born from too much rum and too little sleep. But standing on the deck of the research vessel at 3 a.m, watching the impossible unfold before your eyes, you realize that some legends refuse to stay buried in the past. The island wasn't there at sunset. You're certain of it. You'd scanned the horizon yourself with a high-powered telescope, logged the readings, marked the coordinates. Empty ocean. Nothing but the endless roll of waves beneath the darkening sky. Yet now, in the peculiar light of pre-dawn, there it is, a dark mass rising from the water, like a sleeping giant slowly opening one eye. Dr. Sarah Chen stands beside you, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She's muttering calculations under her breath, her scientific mind struggling to reconcile what her instruments are telling her with what her eyes can see. The sonar readings make no sense. The depth charts you'd mapped just hours ago show nothing but ocean floor 300 meters. Now, the instruments insist there's solid ground, vegetation, even what might be structures. This isn't possible, she says for the 3rd time, though her voice carries less conviction with each repetition. You've been part of this oceanographic expedition for 6 months, cataloguing the unexplored regions of the South Pacific. Your team has discovered new species of deep-sea fish, mapped previously uncharted underwater mountains, even found evidence of ancient volcanic activity. But nothing, absolutely nothing, has prepared you for this. The captain, a weathered Indonesian man named Budi, who spent 40 years navigating these waters, crosses himself and whispers something in a language you don't recognize. When you ask him about it later, he'll tell you about the old stories, about Pulau Hantu, the ghost island, about fishermen who'd stumbled upon it over the centuries, finding fresh water and fruit trees and beaches of black sand, only to return the next day and find nothing but open ocean and the lingering question of their own sanity. As the sun begins its slow climb above the horizon, the island becomes more distinct. You can make out individual trees now, their shapes strange and unfamiliar. There's a beach, just as the stories described, with sand so dark it looks like crushed obsidian. Further inland, you spot what appears to be ruins, stone structures covered in creeping vines, their architecture unlike anything you've seen in your studies of Pacific Island cultures. Sarah has her cameras out now, documenting everything. The scientific method demands evidence, verification, peer review, but you can see the tremor in her hands as she adjusts the lens. Some part of her understands that whatever you're witnessing exists beyond the comfortable boundaries of known science. The captain refuses to approach closer than half a kilometer. His crew, usually boisterous and fearless, works in unusual silence, casting nervous glances toward the impossible island. You don't blame them. There's something fundamentally wrong about the way the island sits in the water, as if it's not quite anchored to reality in the same way as the rest of the world. You volunteer to take the inflatable boat closer. Sarah argues against it. Proper protocol would be to document from a distance, to report the finding, to wait for a larger expedition with more resources. But you both know what will happen. By the time approvals come through and a new team assembles, the island will be gone. This is a moment that exists outside of time, and it demands immediate action. The journey across the half-kilometer of water feels both eternal and instantaneous. The island seems to pulse with each stroke of the oars, growing more solid and real as you approach, yet somehow remaining ephemeral, as if it might dissolve back into sea foam at any moment. The water around it moves strangely too. The waves don't break against the shore the way they should. Instead, they seem to pass through it, as if the island exists slightly out of phase with the surrounding ocean. When the inflatable boat's bow finally scrapes against the black sand, you sit for a long moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what you're doing. You're about to step onto land that shouldn't exist, that your instruments swear appeared out of nowhere in the span of a few hours. Every rational part of your mind screams that this is impossible, yet here you are. The sand crunches beneath your boots with a sound like breaking glass. It's not actually sand, you realize as you crouch to examine it. It's volcanic rock, ground so fine by some unknown process that it mimics the texture of beach sand. You scoop some into a sample container, already imagining the lab analysis, the questions it will raise, papers that might be written if anyone believes you. The air smells wrong. Not bad, exactly, but different. There's the expected salt of the ocean, but underneath it, something else. Ozone, perhaps, or the metallic tang that comes before a lightning strike. The temperature feels off too, several degrees cooler than it should be given the tropical climate and the rising sun. You make your way inland, following what might be a path or might simply be a gap in the vegetation. The plants are unlike anything in your field guides. Some resemble ferns, but with leaves that shimmer with an iridescent quality, catching the light in ways that seem to defy standard botanical behavior. Others look almost familiar, similar to breadfruit or pandanus, but with subtle differences in their structure that mark them as something other. The ruins appear suddenly, emerging from the jungle growth, like teeth from diseased gums. They're made of the same black stone as the sand, but carved with precision that suggests advanced tools and mathematical knowledge. The symbols etched into the surfaces aren't any language you recognize, yet there's something hauntingly familiar about their patterns, as if they're tapping into some deep ancestral memory. You photograph everything, your camera clicking in rapid succession, knowing that physical evidence might be all that stands between you and accusations of elaborate hoaxing or mental breakdown. The structures form a rough circle, 12 pillars surrounding a central platform. On that platform sits something that makes your breath catch, a perfect sphere of what looks like polished obsidian, about the size of a basketball, resting in a carved depression. Your hand reaches toward it before your conscious mind registers the movement. The moment your fingers make contact, everything changes. The island lurches beneath you, or perhaps you lurch, or perhaps reality itself shifts slightly on its axis. The sphere is warm, impossibly warm for stone that's been sitting in pre-dawn air. Heat radiates up your arm, but it's not painful. It's almost pleasant, like sinking into a hot bath after a long, cold day. Images flood your mind, too fast to process individually, but living impressions like photographs developing in solution. You see the island rising from the sea, not through geological processes, but through something else. Intention, perhaps, or need. You see people, their faces both familiar and alien, working the stone, building the structures, placing the sphere with reverent care. You see them leaving, walking into the ocean without fear, the water accepting them as if they belonged there more than on land. You see the island sinking, receding, vanishing beneath waves that close over it like a healing wound. You see it rising again and again and again in a cycle that stretches back further than human memory, further perhaps than humanity itself. When you pull your hand away, gasping, the sun has climbed noticeably higher in the sky. Time has passed, minutes or hours, you can't tell. Your radio crackles with Sarah's voice, tight with worry, demanding to know your status. You respond automatically, assuring her you're fine, that you're returning to the boat, even as your mind struggles to process what just happened. The walk back to the beach feels different. The island seems more solid now, more real, as if your touch somehow anchored it further into existence. Or perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps you've become less real, partially attuned to whatever strange frequency the island vibrates on. You're halfway across the water, back to the research vessel when you hear it. A sound like singing, but deeper than any human voice could produce. It seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the water, through the air, through your very bones. You turn back to look at the island, and for just a moment, you see figures standing on the beach. They're watching you, these impossible people, and though you can't make out their features at this distance, you know they're smiling. By the time you climb aboard the research vessel, your legs shaking from more than just physical exertion, the singing has stopped. Sarah helps you up, firing questions faster than you can answer. The rest of the crew gathers around, their earlier fear overcome by curiosity and the need to know what you found. You tell them everything, knowing how it sounds, watching their expressions shift from excitement to concern to barely concealed skepticism. The photographs will help, you think. The samples will provide proof. But even as you think it, you glance at your camera's display screen and feel your stomach drop. The images are there, technically. The ruins are visible, the strange vegetation, even the sphere. But there's something wrong with them. They're blurred in ways that have nothing to do with camera shake or poor focus. The structures seem to shift position between frames, as if the island couldn't quite decide where its own features should be. The sphere appears in some shots as solid black, in others as translucent, and in one particularly unsettling image, it seems to be looking back at the camera with something distressingly like awareness. Sarah examines the photographs with a deepening frown. She's trying to maintain scientific objectivity, to find rational explanations. Unusual atmospheric conditions, equipment malfunction, anything that fits within the comfortable boundaries of known phenomena. But you can see the doubt creeping into her eyes. This is too strange, too consistent in its strangeness, to be dismissed as simple technical error. The sample container you'd filled with the black sand presents its own mystery. Under the research vessel's microscope, the particles don't behave like volcanic glass should. They seem to move slightly, even in the absence of any vibration or air current, arranging and rearranging themselves into patterns that almost resemble writing. Sarah runs every test she can think of: spectrographic analysis, chemical composition, crystalline structure, and each test returns results that contradict the previous one. As if the substance can't quite decide what it wants to be, Captain Booty keeps the ship at its safe distance, but he's stationed crew members to watch the island constantly. You join them for the vigil as the day progresses, watching the impossible landmass that continues to defy every law of geology and physics by simply existing. During the afternoon, you spot movement on the beach. The same figures you'd glimpsed earlier, though now there are more of them. They don't appear to be doing anything in particular, just existing in their strange, half-real state, occasionally looking out toward the ship with what might be curiosity or might be warning. As evening approaches, Sarah pulls you aside. She's been on the radio with the expedition's funding organization, trying to report the discovery, and the conversation hasn't gone well. Without more concrete evidence, without data that makes sense within accepted scientific frameworks, they're dismissing it as a hoax or hallucination. They're suggesting contaminated water supplies, collective hysteria, even the possibility of a publicity stunt. Frustration radiates off her in waves. "We need to go back," she says quietly. "Both of us this time. More cameras, more samples, detailed measurements, something that can't be explained away or dismissed as equipment malfunction." You know she's right, but something in your gut twists at the thought of returning to that beach, touching that sphere again. The visions it had shown you weren't just images. They were invitations, or perhaps warnings. The island appears and vanishes for a reason, following some pattern or purpose that your brief contact only hinted at. But scientific curiosity wins out over caution, as it so often does. As the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, you and Sarah prepare another expedition to the island. This time, you bring more equipment: ground-penetrating radar, core sampling tools, electromagnetic field detectors, anything that might provide objective data about this impossible place. The figures on the beach watch as you approach. In the golden light of late afternoon, you can see them more clearly now. They're human in shape, but not quite in substance, as if they're made of water and light and memory, rather than flesh and bone. They don't try to stop you as you land the inflatable boat and haul your equipment onto the black sand. They simply watch, with expressions that might be sadness, or might be something else entirely. Sarah sets up the ground-penetrating radar while you begin taking soil samples. The work is methodical, familiar, grounding. It helps to focus on concrete tasks, to let your hands remember their training, while your mind grapples with the impossible nature of your surroundings. The radar, however, refuses to cooperate. It shows the island extending down into the water, but the readings fluctuate wildly. One moment the island has roots reaching hundreds of meters into the ocean floor. The next moment it appears to be floating on the surface like a lily pad. The next, it seems to exist simultaneously at multiple depths. You make your way back to the ruins, Sarah following close behind. The electromagnetic field detectors are going haywire, their needles swinging back and forth as if caught in an invisible storm. The sphere still sits on its platform, warm and patient, waiting. This time, you approach it with more caution, pulling out a thermal imaging camera first. The camera's display shows the sphere as a point of intense heat, far hotter than it feels to your nearby skin. But it's not radiating that heat into the surrounding air the way physics demands it should. Instead, the thermal energy seems to be flowing into the sphere from somewhere else, as if it's connected to some distant source of power through channels you can't perceive. Sarah reaches out to touch it, but you stop her. "Wait," you say, and spend several minutes explaining what happened when you made contact earlier. The visions, the lost time, the sense of being fundamentally changed by the experience. She listens with the careful attention of a scientist evaluating experimental protocols, then reaches out anyway. Her reaction is different from yours. Where you had been overwhelmed by images and sensations, she seems to achieve some kind of communion with the sphere. Her eyes lose focus, but not in a way that suggests unconsciousness. Instead, she appears to be looking at something vast and complex, her expression shifting through wonder, fear, understanding, and finally a kind of peaceful acceptance. When she pulls away, tears are streaming down her face. "It's not an island," she whispers. "It's a message, a warning." She struggles to articulate what she experienced, her scientific vocabulary failing to capture the essence of what the sphere communicated. But gradually, a picture emerges. The island is a marker, placed here millennia ago by people or beings who understood that the ocean holds memory the way stone holds heat. They'd witnessed something, some great catastrophe or transformation, and they'd created this place as a warning for those who would come after. The island appears when conditions align, when the same confluence of factors that preceded the ancient disaster begins to manifest again. You ask what disaster, what danger could be so important that it warranted creating something that defies the laws of nature? Sarah shakes her head, frustrated by the limitations of language and human perception. "It's about balance," she says finally. "The ocean, the land, the boundary between them. When that balance shifts too far, when too much is taken or too much is given, the system corrects itself. Violently, the implications settle over you like a heavy blanket. The rising sea levels, the changing ocean chemistry, the warming waters, all the environmental changes that your expedition has been documenting. According to the sphere's message, these aren't just concerning trends. They're symptoms of an approaching threshold, a point of no return after which the ocean will reclaim what it has lost, reshaping coastlines and swallowing cities in a correction that has happened before and will happen again. The sun is touching the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seem too vivid to be natural. The figures on the beach have multiplied, dozens of them now, perhaps hundreds. They're moving toward the water, their forms becoming more translucent as they approach the waves. You realize with a chill that you're watching the same departure you'd seen in your vision, the island's creators returning to the ocean that spawns them, or accepting it as their final resting place. Sarah is frantically trying to document everything, but her equipment is failing in increasingly spectacular ways. Cameras short out, batteries drain in seconds, recording devices capture only static, The island is preparing to depart, and it seems determined not to leave behind evidence that would let the world dismiss its warning as fantasy or fraud. You feel it in your bones when the transition begins. A subtle shift in the air pressure, a change in the way sound travels, as if reality is holding its breath. The sphere on its platform begins to glow, not with light exactly, but with a kind of concentrated darkness that somehow illuminates rather than obscures. The ruins around it start to hum, a sound that you feel more than hear, resonating at a frequency that makes your teeth ache and your vision blur. "We need to leave," you tell Sarah, grabbing her arm. "Now." She resists for a moment, unwilling to abandon the opportunity for observation. But then she feels it too. The island pulling away from the world, sliding back into whatever impossible space it occupies between appearances. You run for the beach, your equipment abandoned, the scientific method forgotten in the face of more primal imperatives. The inflatable boat seems impossibly far away, though it can't be more than 100 meters. The sand is changing beneath your feet, becoming less solid, more fluid, as if the island is already halfway to being ocean again. The figures in the water watch you struggle toward salvation, their expressions understanding but unsympathetic. This is the price of knowledge, their ancient eyes seem to say. This is the burden of witness. You reach the boat and shove it into the water, Sarah tumbling in beside you. Your hands fumble with the oars, clumsy with panic and haste. Behind you, the island is visibly sinking now, the ruins disappearing beneath rising water, the strange vegetation folding in on itself like a flower closing at nightfall. The sphere's glow intensifies one final time, and in that flash you see it all clearly. The pattern, the cycle, the inevitable conclusion that waits at the end of current trends. The research vessel seems to take forever to reach, though Captain Booty has brought it as close as he dares. Hands reach down to pull you aboard, voices asking questions you can't yet answer. You collapse on the deck, gasping, watching the place where the island had been. There's nothing there now but water, reflecting the last light of day, giving no indication that anything unusual ever existed in that spot. Sarah sits beside you, her scientific composure finally cracking. She's laughing and crying simultaneously, the sound slightly hysterical, but also somehow triumphant. You've witnessed something impossible, something that will change how you understand the world, even if you can never prove it to anyone else. That night, as the research vessel motors away from the coordinates that now show nothing but empty ocean, you and Sarah compile your evidence. The blurred photographs, the inconsistent sample readings, the equipment failures, all of it adds up to a story that no one will believe. But you have to try. The island appeared for a reason, delivered its warning to those who would listen. You spend hours writing the report, trying to find words that convey the urgency without sounding like madness. Sarah contributes technical details, scientific observations, anything that might lend credibility. When you're finished, you both know it's not enough. The world isn't ready to believe in impossible islands and ancient warnings delivered through obsidian spheres. The evidence is too ambiguous, too easily dismissed. But as dawn breaks on a new day, you realize that belief isn't actually necessary. The warning has been delivered, whether anyone accepts it or not. The island will appear again when conditions warrant, will continue its cycle of emergence and submergence, faithful to its purpose across centuries and millennia. You stand on the deck and look back toward the horizon, toward the spot where the impossible briefly became real. The ocean keeps its secrets well, you think, but sometimes when the need is great enough, it shares them with those who have the courage to listen. Captain Booty joins you at the rail, his weathered face thoughtful. "My grandfather saw it once," he says quietly. "Told me stories when I was young. I thought he was just an old man, his mind going, making up tales." He pauses, then adds, "I'm sorry I didn't believe him. I understand now why he spent his last years trying to warn people about the ocean's patience running out." The research vessel sails on through calm seas, carrying you back toward a world that will never quite make sense again. Somewhere in your cabin, the sample container sits with its impossible sand, still shifting into patterns that might be writing or might be random movement. The photographs fill your camera's memory, blurred evidence of something that existed between one moment and the next. You know you'll spend the rest of your career trying to understand what you witnessed, trying to decode the warning, trying to find a way to make people listen. Sarah will too, her scientific skepticism transformed into evangelical certainty by the touch of the sphere. Together, you'll become those people others whisper about, the scientists who claim to have found an island that can't exist, who warn about disasters written in ancient stone and encoded in volcanic glass. But on quiet nights, when sleep eludes you, and the sound of waves reminds you of that impossible shore, you'll know the truth. The island will appear again, exactly when it needs to, carrying its message forward through time. And somewhere, the ocean keeps its vigil, patient and eternal, waiting to see if humanity will finally learn to listen before the balance tips too far and the correction begins. The warning has been given. The rest, as it always has been, is up to those who have the wisdom to heed it.